Today we will explore one of the most fascinating transformations in the history of human civilization, the evolution of writing materials during the Middle Ages, from the decline of papyrus to the printing revolution. Before continuing with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this one. Imagine for a moment a world without paper. Imagine a time when every written word represented a considerable investment of time, resources, and skill. Imagine scribes working by candlelight in silent monasteries, transforming animal skins into book pages that would span centuries. This is the story of how humanity preserved its knowledge during one of the most challenging periods of Western history, and how seemingly simple innovations completely transformed the way we share ideas. In the ancient world, long before the medieval era that we will explore in detail, there existed a plant that grew abundantly on the swampy banks of the Nile River in Egypt. Papyrus, with its tall and fibrous stalks, provided the raw material for the primary writing material of the Mediterranean world. The ancient Egyptians developed an ingenious technique to transform this plant into sheets suitable for writing. They cut the stalks into thin strips, arranged these strips in 2 layers perpendicular to each other, and then beat them while they were still moist until they fused naturally. After drying under pressure, the result was a surface remarkably suited to receive ink. Papyrus dominated the world of writing for millennia. In ancient Greece and Rome, the standard format for a book was the papyrus roll. These rolls were written in columns arranged side by side, read horizontally from left to right in Greek and Latin texts, or from right to left in cultures that wrote in that manner. The rolls were stored in chests and round boxes, and scholars handled them with care, unrolling one section while rolling up another. However, this form of book presented significant limitations. Writing could only be done on one side of the papyrus, the side where the fibers ran horizontally, as the opposite side did not retain ink properly. Furthermore, the rolls had no page numbers, making the search for specific passages a time-consuming and frustrating task for any scholar. While papyrus reigned as the primary writing material, another more modest technology served everyday uses that did not demand permanence. Wax tablets, known since at least the 7th century before, the Common Era in Italy, offered a practical and economical solution for temporary writing needs. These were wooden boards, often made of boxwood or a tree from the cypress family, hollowed out in the center and filled with a layer of beeswax mixed with resin, turpentine, or linseed oil. The wax was generally dyed black or dark green so that the engraved letters would stand out clearly against the background. To write on these tablets, an instrument called a stylus was used, a rod of metal, bone, or wood with a sharp point at one end and a flattened end at the other. The point served to engrave the letters into the wax, while the flattened part functioned as an eraser, smoothing the surface to delete what had been written. The Latin term tabula rasa itself, which means a clean slate, derives from this practice of smoothing the wax to start over. The expression entered the philosophical vocabulary and remains in use today, a testament to the lasting influence of this seemingly simple technology. Writing on wax required a different technique from that used for writing with ink on papyrus or parchment. The stylus needed to be pressed with more force, and it had to be lifted between each stroke, which naturally favored letters with straighter and more angular shapes, without the curves and loops that characterize fluid writing with a quill. Wax tablets were often joined in pairs, called diptychs, or in larger sets like small portable books that could be carried and consulted as needed. In ancient Rome and throughout the Middle Ages, wax tablets served an impressive variety of purposes. In schools, they were the basic instrument for teaching writing. The teacher would trace the letters in the wax for the student to copy, and errors could be easily erased and corrected. Roman writers like Horace and Quintilian emphasized the importance of tablets precisely because they allowed the student to make mistakes and correct them without wasting material. In commerce, they recorded temporary transactions and lists of goods. In domestic life, they served for quick notes, reminders, and even personal messages. It is remarkable that wax tablets remained in commercial use until the 19th century. The records of the salt mining authority in Schwäbisch Hall, Germany, continued to be kept on wax tablets until the year 1812. This demonstrates the durability and practicality of this seemingly primitive technology, which survived for more than 2,500 years precisely because it fulfilled its function in a simple and effective manner. But the great transformation in the world of writing materials was yet to come, driven by political events that no one could have predicted. In the 7th century of the Common Era, a new and powerful force emerged from the Arabian Peninsula. The armies of the nascent Islamic Caliphate, inspired by the faith revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, expanded with impressive speed in all directions. After defeating the Byzantines at the Battle of Yarmouk in 636 and the Persians at Qadisiyah in 637, the Arab generals turned their eyes toward Egypt, one of the richest and most strategically important provinces of the Byzantine Empire. General Amr ibn al-As crossed into Egypt in late 639 or early 640 with a relatively modest force of about 4,000 mounted men. He knew the region well, both from his travels as a merchant and from having led a previous military expedition to Gaza. Egypt was then a land of extraordinary agricultural wealth. The Nile Delta, with its fertile lands irrigated by the great river, produced enough grain to feed Egypt itself and still export large quantities to Constantinople. It was the granary of the Byzantine Empire. The conquest was surprisingly fast. After taking the fortress of Pelusium on the border, the Arabs advanced through the desert to Belbis and then to Heliopolis, on the outskirts of modern Cairo. The Roman fortress of Babylon, with its walls more than 18 meters high and 2 meters thick, resisted for a few months but fell in April 641. With the death of Emperor Heraclius that same year, the Byzantine defenders lost hope of receiving reinforcements. Alexandria, the glorious capital founded by Alexander the Great, surrendered in September 642. The historian Hugh Kennedy observed that of all the early Muslim conquests, that of Egypt was the fastest and most complete. Rarely in history has such a massive political change happened so quickly and lasted so long. The Arab conquest of Egypt had consequences that extended far beyond the borders of that land. Mediterranean trade was profoundly affected, and one of the most significant consequences for the history of writing was the interruption of the papyrus supply to Europe and the Byzantine Empire. Papyrus plantations continued to exist in the Nile Delta for some time, but exports to Christian territories ceased, either because the Arabs retained the available supply for their own use, or as a form of economic warfare, or simply because trade routes were disrupted. The scarcity of papyrus forced a transformation in the writing habits of the Mediterranean and European world. The material that gradually took the place of papyrus had already been known for centuries, but its use had been limited because it was significantly more expensive. This material was parchment, made from the treated skin of animals, mainly sheep, goats, and calves. The production of parchment was a laborious and specialized process. After the animal was slaughtered, the skin was removed and soaked in a solution of water and lime for several days. This chemical bath loosened the hair and the remains of flesh still adhering to the skin. The smell produced by this process was so unpleasant that medieval tanneries were generally relegated to the outskirts of cities or to areas far from residential neighborhoods. After immersion in lime, the skin was stretched on a wooden frame called a hearse and scraped with a special curved knife known as a lunellum. The craftsman scraped both sides of the skin, removing hair from one side and remains of fat and flesh from the other, working gradually until the desired thickness and uniformity were obtained. This process of scraping and stretching could take from several days to a week. Unlike leather, parchment was not tanned, as tanning would make the surface stiffer and less suitable for receiving ink. The cost of parchment was substantial. To produce a single sheet, it was necessary to sacrifice an animal that could otherwise continue providing wool if it were a sheep, or milk if it were a goat or cow. It is estimated that the production of the Codex Amiatinus, a famous 8th century Latin translation of the Bible, required the skins of approximately 500 sheep for its more than 2,000 pages. The Book of Kells, a masterpiece of Celtic art created around the year 800, used about 185 calfskins, while the Lindisfarne Gospels from the 8th century required approximately 150. The most refined form of parchment was called vellum, made specifically from the skin of young calves. Vellum was thinner, softer, and more uniform than common parchment, making it the preferred material for luxury manuscripts, important legal documents, and works intended for high-ranking clients. Modern research using DNA analysis has demonstrated that while these exceptionally thin parchments did indeed exist, in most cases they represented the work of extraordinarily skilled craftsmen. At the same time that parchment was replacing papyrus as a writing material, another equally significant transformation was occurring in the form of books. The ancient papyrus roll was being replaced by a new format, the codex. A codex is essentially what we today call a book, with sheets of uniform size folded and bound along one edge, the spine, and protected between two covers. The word codex comes from the Latin codex, which originally meant a tree trunk or block of wood. The exact origin of the codex format remains debated among scholars, but one theory suggests it may have evolved from the practice of tying several wax tablets together. Early Christians seem to have adopted the codex format with particular enthusiasm, and throughout the 3rd and 4th centuries, the codex gradually replaced the roll as the standard form for books. The advantages of the codex over the roll were numerous and significant. First, unlike papyrus, parchment could receive writing on both sides, effectively doubling the amount of text that could be contained in a given amount of material. Second, the codex was more compact and easier to transport than a roll. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the codex could have page numbers, allowing readers to find specific passages much more quickly. The spine could receive a title, facilitating the identification of the book when stored on a shelf. The combination of the parchment codex and the scarcity of papyrus created a paradoxical situation. On the one hand, books were now more practical and durable than ever. On the other, the material to produce them was more expensive and harder to obtain. This tension led to a practice that today seems fascinating to us, the recycling of old manuscripts for reuse. This practice produced what we know as palimpsests. The word palimpsest comes from the Greek palimpsestos, which means scraped again. A palimpsest is a manuscript whose original text was scraped or washed off so that the page could be reused for a new text. Parchment was durable enough to survive this cleaning process. The method for cleaning parchment varied according to the time and place. In the early medieval centuries, the most common technique involved washing the ink with a mixture of milk and oat bran. This process was relatively gentle and often left perceptible traces of the original text, which over time tended to reappear as the pigments of the old ink migrated back to the surface. In the later Middle Ages, the preferred technique was to scrape the surface of the vellum with powdered pumice stone, which removed the text more completely, but also irreversibly destroyed the original writing. The creation of palimpsests was so common that in 691 a synodal decree prohibited the destruction of manuscripts of the scriptures or of the Church Fathers, except when the volumes were imperfect or damaged. This prohibition increased the pressure on manuscripts containing secular works, which could be recycled without incurring ecclesiastical sanction. Obsolete legal texts and works by pagan authors were particularly vulnerable to being transformed into clean parchment. Ironically, the very practice that destroyed so many ancient texts also preserved some for posterity in an unexpected way. The most celebrated example is the Archimedes palimpsest, a 10th century parchment codex containing works by the great Greek mathematician. Around 1229, this precious manuscript was scraped and washed in a Christian monastery in Palestine, and its leaves were reused to create a Byzantine prayer book. For nearly 700 years, Archimedes' treatises remained hidden beneath the prayers. With modern imaging technologies, scholars recovered two treatises by Archimedes, the Method of Mechanical Theorems, and the Stomachion, which do not exist in any other copy. While medieval Europe struggled with the scarcity of writing materials, a new technology was slowly making its way from Asia toward the West. This technology was paper. The invention is traditionally attributed to Kai Lun, a Chinese court official in the year 105 of the Common Era. From its place of origin, in China, paper technology spread gradually along the Silk Road. Arab expansion in the 8th century brought papermaking to the Islamic world after the Battle of Talas in 751, when the Arabs captured Chinese craftsmen who knew the secrets of paper production. Paper arrived in Europe by way of Islamic Spain. The oldest known paper document in Europe is the Mozarabic Missal of Silos, from the 11th century. The first documented paper mill on the peninsula was established in Zativa in 1056, and by 1150 production was firmly established in that city. During the 13th century, paper mills emerged in Italy in the cities of Amalfi, Fabriano and Treviso. The technology continued to spread north, reaching Nuremberg in 1390. European paper differed significantly from its eastern predecessors. Instead of fresh plant fibers, European manufacturers mainly used old linen and hemp rags. These rags were collected by a class of workers known as rag pickers, who roamed the city streets buying or collecting discarded fabrics. A crucial innovation was the use of water mills to beat the rags, allowing for a massive expansion of production. The first certain record of a water-powered paper mill dates back to 1282. Paper offered several advantages. Over parchment, it was significantly cheaper, costing approximately 1/6 the price of parchment of comparable quality. Production was faster. A team of 3 papermakers could produce about 2,000 sheets in a single day, while the production of an equivalent amount of parchment would require weeks of work. Furthermore, paper made from linen and hemp rags was extraordinarily durable. Many paper books from the 14th century have survived to this day in practically impeccable condition. Despite these advantages, the acceptance of paper in Europe was initially slow. Paper was seen as an invention of the Islamic world. Landowners who raised sheep and cattle for parchment production had an interest in maintaining their established markets. In 1231, Emperor Frederick II prohibited the use of paper for official documents, ordering that only parchment be used in court records. It took the advent of another revolutionary technology for paper to finally conquer Europe, the printing press with movable type. Johannes Gutenberg, a goldsmith from Mainz, Germany, developed his printing system throughout the 1440s. He created an integrated system that combined cast metal type, a screw press adapted from the region's wine presses, and a specially formulated viscous ink that adhered well to metal and transferred cleanly to paper. Gutenberg's first major achievement was the printing of his famous 42-line Bible, completed around 1455. It is estimated that between 160 and 185 copies were printed, of which about 3/4 were on paper and the remainder on high-quality vellum. The printing press multiplied the demand for paper explosively. One press could produce more than 3,000 pages in a single working day, compared with about 40 pages that a manual scribe could produce. By the year 1500, printing presses operated in more than 250 cities across Europe, and about 20 million volumes had been printed. By the end of the 16th century, this number had jumped to as many as 200 million books. The printing revolution profoundly transformed European society. Access to books, previously restricted to the clerical and aristocratic elite, expanded dramatically. Book prices fell. Literacy increased. The Protestant Reformation, initiated by Martin Luther in 1517, would have been unthinkable without the ability to rapidly disseminate ideas through pamphlets and printed books. Medieval scribes, who for centuries had preserved human knowledge by copying texts word for word, saw their fundamental craft transformed. Many adapted to the new circumstances, finding employment in printing workshops or producing decorative luxury manuscripts for clients who still appreciated the art of manual writing. And so, we reach the end of one era and the beginning of another. Papyrus, which for millennia had carried the words of philosophers, poets, merchants, and rulers, disappeared from common use. The roll gave way to the codex with its numbered pages and protective covers. Wax tablets were gradually relegated to increasingly specialized uses, and scribes saw their work transformed by the machine. In each stage of this evolution, we can observe the fascinating interaction between material necessity, technological innovation, and cultural transformation. The Arab conquest of Egypt had unexpected consequences for the history of writing in Europe. The scarcity of one material led to the adoption of another, and this adoption in turn influenced the form of books and the practices of scribes. The arrival of paper, a technology developed in China more than 1,000 years earlier, revolutionized book production only when combined with the printing press. And printing transformed not only the production of books but the very structure of society. What makes this story particularly relevant for us today is the continuity it reveals. The transition from the manuscript to the printed book was, in its time, just as revolutionary as the transformations we witness today. The people of the 15th century saw their world transformed by technology in ways they could not have predicted, just as we see ours. The debates we have today about access to information and the role of technology in education echo similar debates held centuries ago. As we look at the scribes in their scriptoria, at the parchment makers, at Gutenberg fine-tuning his press, we can see not only the past, but also a mirror of the present. Technologies change, materials evolve, but the fundamental questions about how we preserve and share knowledge remain constant. We are the heirs of a tradition that spans millennia, and at the same time, the pioneers of a new era whose shape we are still discovering. If you have made it this far, you have demonstrated the same kind of curiosity and patience that medieval scribes cultivated in their scriptoria. Just as they dedicated hours to preserving knowledge for future generations, you have dedicated your time to absorbing this story that spans centuries. This deserves to be recognized. In the same way that medieval readers passed manuscripts from hand to hand, sharing knowledge in a time when every book was precious, you can help spread this story. Subscribe to the channel to follow more narratives like this one, which seek to illuminate the forgotten corners of human history. Leave a comment sharing your reflections or your questions, like the video, so that it can reach other curious minds like yours. And if you know someone who would appreciate this journey through time, share it. Thus, together, we continue the great tradition of transmitting knowledge, a tradition that began long before us and will continue long after. Thank you for joining me in this exploration, and until the next story.